Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. My name is Philip Heitzen, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement and advisor to procurement leaders around the world. I started out of procurement to help leaders and their teams access the resources they need to increase their impact through insight-driven procurement. You are listening to our flagship podcast where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their impact with the needs of their business. And today on the show, I'm delighted to welcome Sarah Kaye, the Director of Sourcing at Spin, a part of Ford Mobility. Sarah brings a passion for marketing and procurement experience working for organizations such as Target, Radisson Hotel Group, and WeWork to Spin, where she's responsible for building and growing Spin's first procurement team. In our conversation today, we discuss how Sarah is building a procurement capability that truly aligns with the needs of the business and how she is putting into practice her marketing skills to build and sell the procurement value proposition. So let's go into our conversation where I start by asking Sarah if she found procurement or if procurement found her.
Well, first off, thanks so much for having me, Phil. I'm really excited to be here to talk. Procurement actually found me. Kind of funny, when I was a kid, my mom always said that I should be a lawyer because I was very persistent and very persuasive as a kid. That wasn't always an appeal for me. And actually, I got my degree in marketing from my undergrad. And actually, when I started working in a sourcing company in the marketing department. And then started to get closer with their leadership, started learning more about the world of manufacturing and really found an interest in it. And then when I started traveling overseas to understand our factory and start overseeing production, I realized that this is where I'd found my platform where I could start to negotiate much more effectively than I ever would in a courtroom.
It's funny. One, it's kind of a nice way of framing that you're persistent. As a kid, I think of our kids and the persistence, and it's more demanding than, how can you put that into a career?
Yes.
Do you, as you did marketing as your undergrad degree, do you feel like today within procurement, there's things that you can take from that marketing kind of background that perhaps help you look at procurement in a different way than what somebody who may not have had that experience does?
Yeah, I really do actually, because I feel like with marketing, everything that I look at, all of the projects, anything that we want to do or buy, I really think of how does it impact at the end of the day our customer?
Mm-hmm.
And, is that going to move the needle for the customer? And so it really helps me when I'm looking at what we're trying to achieve. Is that little amount of savings going to, at the end of the day, impact the customer's experience or not? So I really have that full end-to-end lens on the return on that investment.
Yeah, I love that. And I know I want to dig deeper into that a little bit later because I think that that's really important because it's one of the things we're challenged with in procurement and is definitely on the lips of a lot of procurement leaders right now is how to build that credibility and that alignment much more closely with procurement than in the past. Um, Before I go there, just for some additional context, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your current role and about Spin Mobility.
Yeah, definitely. So at Spin, I was hired here to build out and lead our procurement department. So Spin started in 2017 and started as a startup and started growing very quickly. And especially once Ford purchased us, we started growing internationally quite a bit. So with that, definitely realized the need for a procurement department and start bringing some best practices there. So my role is to build out that procurement department, establish those best practices, and really make sure that we are seeing that return on our investment.
Mm-hmm. And for folks who don't know Spin, you offer kind of like the rental scooters and bikes from city to city. There's probably a better way for me to say that than that. So perhaps you'll do a better job of it. But
No, you did it. That's kind of how I tell my family too, but it's really our mobility space.
right.
So Spin is right. It's electric mobility. So we believe in building cities where you can have these 15-minute cities where anywhere you need to travel, we have that ability, so you can get there via scooter. If you don't own a car, if you don't have transportation, you have that ability to just take out your phone, rent one of our scooters
Mhm.
or e-bikes, we call them, and get to where you need to be.
You said it far more eloquently than I was trying to butcher.
No, no.
Uh, Now, as you come to procurement and you've basically got a blank piece of paper, how did you start to think about what are we here for? What is the purpose of a procurement organization that actually helps the business achieve the objectives that the business has?
Yeah, I think that every business, every department, if you will, they're all our internal stakeholders, and they're all truly like my customers in a
Mhm.
sense, because with us in procurement, we really are a supportive function, and so we look to help every department get to where they need to go, essentially, and meet their needs. So I like to individually meet with each department and build these relationships so that I can help determine what are their interests, what are
Right.
they trying to achieve, what are their goals, and what are their goals today, but what are their goals in the next 2, 3 years. Especially as like I said, we were a startup that's growing wind very quickly. So, we have broader years goals over the next 2 years and
Mhm.
probably some of the well-established corporations where they have to be more sophisticated in their growth. So with that, I built out my strategy to really make sure I can support theirs.
Yeah, and what they may look for, like the value levers that they may look for from a procurement perspective, I imagine are pretty varied. Running from speed to ensuring that the folks who are the most highly paid spend their time doing the things they're highly paid to do,
Right.
which means you kind of got to look at each department differently and building a value prop for them that actually helps them achieve what they do rather than doing a little bit of a one size fits all.
Yeah, exactly. And coming in from procurement, procurement tends to have this like rep, if you will, that we just care about getting the best price.
Yeah.
But I really have to, make sure, and I feel very strongly and passionate, as probably a lot of us procurement individuals do, that we need to shed that rep and
Yeah.
make sure that, we're almost in an interview ourselves with every meeting with a new stakeholder coming into it to make sure that they know we're not here to just get the best price. I mean, yes, that's obvious. Like savings are obvious for us that we need to do that and that we're, that's an objective. But especially for a company like Spin, I mean, we want, speed to the market to beat our competitors to an area. Innovation, we want to make sure that we have technology that really suits that end of use rider, like I was
Mhm.
mentioning. We need global reach. We need to make sure that we're sustainable. We need to make sure that we're working with suppliers that that are have shorter lead times. So I think in that case, being able to explain to my stakeholders that that's my job. You get to focus on making sure that your engineers are crafting the right, are working day in and day out to make sure our scooters are safe and reliable and everything that we need them to be. Marketing, you need to make sure you're looking for, where should we be operating so everybody knows that our scooters are there to support them.
Mhm.
I need to make sure that I can get you what you need as fast and efficient and when you need it. And so being able to say, I get to take that off your plate, and that's my job to make sure that we bring innovation, speed to market, global reach. I think that once you start getting there and building the relationships, then the floodgates start being open and
Yeah.
procurement starts shedding that rep and you start getting, reached out to much more frequently.
Yeah, it's like that first interaction is so important because that's where, in an environment that's in a startup environment where you haven't had procurement in the past, you've got all these people who are just used to doing all the buying themselves, and they're probably used to being doing it without that many controls because, you do what you need to do to enable growth. And so you're coming into the conversation now, and they're perhaps afraid, well, procurement's here to stop me doing what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And those interactions at the very beginning are going to frame how they see you. So,
Right.
do you find that that's taking that approach helps you in those first conversations kind of reframe what someone's perception of what procurement's going to do for them is?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people, like you said, because they're executing these purchase orders or they're executing contracts just to get it done, right? So everybody's just got a million things that they have to do on their do list, and that's one thing that they need to cross off. So they're doing it to get it done. Whereas from procurement, I'm framing those conversations to say, let me take that over for you, but I'm not going to just get it done. I want to go about it in a strategic way.
Yeah.
I want to look at what's the purchase need today, but I'm going to talk to HR. I'm going to talk to finance. I'm going to know if you just need to buy a software and you're looking to just make sure you have that software for next month and for the headcount that you need to access it today. I'm going to talk to HR and find out what's our headcount that you're looking to hire throughout the end of the year. And I'm going to talk, and then the following year, and then I'm going to talk to finance and say, do you actually have the budget for that headcount? Do you actually have the budget for that software for this year, for the next year, the following? If not, how do we get that? Because I need to help advocate the case with you. And I'll be I'll help advocate that with these team members for this department. And so having that conversation and explaining that I'm really there to support them and advocate for them is where they find that value.
How do you drive there's the balance between being available, and especially when you're starting to build relationships with stakeholders for the first time, and not being able to do everything, especially the stuff that's kind of the time consuming stuff. Now, sometimes the time consuming stuff is the stuff that's important, as we said before, what's their objectives and how can you help them? But there's this kind of balance between being there to do everything and where you have to say no. And I just wonder, how do you approach that? Or are there certain things where you look and say, set the expectation around this is where I can help you and perhaps this is where I can't help you?
Yeah, it's a great question, honestly, because it's the constant struggle where with procurement, you want everybody to come to you because you want to make sure that they want you to come help and add value. Right. And you are fearful to say no because you don't want them to take that as now I won't go back and ask again for help. So you take on more than you probably can or should. But that's where you learn to prioritize, and whether it's putting in establishing a set through, whether it's through the contractual dollar value by saying, if any contracts are above this dollar threshold, loop me in and I'll lead that. If it's between X and, Y dollar value, I will give you any sort of resources. I'll give you tips and pointers. I'll give you advice on what I think you should, ask for. And I'll give you advice on which stakeholders to loop in as well for additional thoughts. And then anything below a certain dollar value is, very low complexity and routine. Just go purchase that. There's no risk associated. And those you can make sure that you don't get a bottleneck or become a bottleneck with.
How do you think about policy? Policy is one of those things where you start going around and saying, hey, we need to put a procurement policy in place. And everybody gets a little bit nervous because that's where they think of, oh, well, you're just coming to tell me what to do and constrain my ability to do the things I've always done before. But obviously really important to be able to manage and kind of set expectations and roles and responsibilities around. So I just wonder how you approached, putting policy, putting process in place without making things too rigid.
Yeah. So what I was just explaining of the dollar thresholds and when to approach procurement and when I can support, that's all within our procurement policy. And I've written a few at different companies. And it's funny because in my career, I've been at, large corporations like Target and like Radisson Hotel Group. And I've been at, WeWork, which is a little bit more of a startup that grew massively. And then now Spin, which is similar in that, where it's a startup that's now getting a really larger scale quickly. And so building out the procurement policies from what I've seen in the past and what I've built in the past, I take from that to make sure that it's something that isn't going to be just put on the internet and never looked at or usable. I really look to make it a user guide. So I try to make the policies no more than 1 to 2 pages, 2 pages at the absolute most. And that's because I really want it to be actionable. So a policy says, if you need to make a purchase, this is what you do. If it's between this dollars, if it's for routine, if it's a one-time, and it's an actionable policy. So it's not something that's, here's absolutely every single thing about procurement and our process and what we do. If they want to know that, ask me. I'm happy to set that meeting. But I'm not going to put that in a document that is outdated in a year and, and sits there and does nothing to add any value. So my approach to a procurement policy is to make it actionable and to make it something that has links to how to. So
Hmm.
if you need to execute an order in, our system where we're cutting purchase orders, if you need to have that created, here's the link to exactly the step-by-step guide. And, the links are embedded so that you're not questioning, okay, this is what I'm supposed to do. How do I do it?
I love that because I think that when you're starting from scratch, you have the ability to build as much as you can around a self-service model. Which kind of goes against, I think, a lot of the larger organizations that you've worked in, the traditional procurement groups, which often find themselves in a position where it's all about, I want to bring in as much spend as possible. I'm going to measure my success on spend under management. Whereas you're in a position where you can't do everything for everybody, but you want to demonstrate your value. So you become more consultative, and helping folks self-serve as much as they can
Right.
is definitely a way to do that, while you're still present, but you're not having to spend all the time doing all this stuff for everybody.
Right, absolutely. And I think we just need to make sure that we are prioritizing where we can make the most impact, and making sure that we're adding value to smaller contracts, but especially so that the right stakeholders, these stakeholders know that they don't only get procurement support if it's a contract that's over a certain dollar value,
Right.
that we're there for all of the needs. It's just a different way that we're going to service those needs, but we still want them to feel that they're supported and that we're here, and that we can teach them how to fish in a way, right? So that they know the process if they don't want to engage, if they just want to get something, executed quickly and it's a smaller need.
Now, how do you go about catching those that are, because I think this is one of the biggest issues that we have when we go down the road of using spend as the indicator of importance. And there's so often some of the biggest spend contracts, they're not necessarily the most critical to the success of the business. They just happen to be high volume for whatever reason. And then you miss the ones that are really important. The $10,000 experiment with somebody who can really change the face of a department or a product or whatever it may be. And I just wonder how you, or if you're able to kind of figure out what those deals are where you need to be involved with a small dollar, where otherwise they may have just gone not by the wayside, but you just wouldn't have seen them so much. But they're really important for you to get involved with early.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and it's a good question because spend is not always, just like savings is not always the right, KPI,
Yeah.
right? So spend isn't either, and it's just the most commonly one today to make it an easy rule for when and not to engage procurement, because we all are limited on our resources, of course, but thankfully, because we're in our infancy at Spin of procurement, people come as often as possible, just because through word of mouth is how you really build the most, I would say, clientele, whether it's
Mhm.
procurement or real estate or whatever the industry. Your best advocate and the best support is always through word of mouth of other stakeholders that have utilized you. So I think by continuing with every interaction, of explaining, I don't, while our threshold and our policy states this, and I'll keep it on the policy. I haven't written anything in that's descriptive to say, however, if this is impactful to the business and
Yeah.
under a certain, that's kind of hard to lay out. But through conversations,
Right.
and earning trust, it's really up to the stakeholders to know something has the potential to make more impact, and they approach me in those as well. So it's really about building that trust so that people want you to participate and support in anything, whether it's, you're in a better position if they're over asking rather than under, right?
Yeah, that's a lot of that sounds like the marketing in you speaking as well, because I feel the same, and I did marketing as well in my undergrad with business. So I came to procurement definitely with not a procurement or the logistics kind of mindset. But it's because I had that mindset, it was always like I have to provide a value proposition that's compelling enough that somebody wants to ask for it. And if I'm not doing that, if I'm having to be reactive or I'm having to push myself on too many people, yes, you do at the startup stage because you need people to get to know who you are. But ultimately, if you're not having people coming and knocking on your door asking for help, then you're not doing a good job because you're not important enough or having a good enough impact that people really care that you're there.
Right, right. And actually, yeah, it's our best problem to have too many contracts.
Yeah.
And also, I've been counted, and I love to hear this. It's hard, but I love it. Is when somebody comes to me for a contract and a stakeholder says, I need your help. I'm working on this contract. I need you to help me with this. And I say, okay, I'm going to have to give that one to somebody else on my team that reports to me. And when people say, no, I want you to work on this because we've already built that relationship, we've
Hmm.
built that rapport, they trust and they know how I negotiate with vendors and my strategies. But I have to reassure them that I train my team the same way. So,
Yeah.
we all will do a great job, no matter which one, but it's one of the best problems to have, right? Because you're building that relationship. But my role, I see it is I really act as one of my team. So even though whether it's me working on a contract or somebody that reports to me, I want anybody to feel as if this is the procurement
Yeah.
policy and process, and it's all best practice and what we would do for any.
It's funny. It sounds like, you're the founder of a startup and that startup is procurement. And, in the early days, it's all about you and you having to run around and do everything. And then once you start getting the traction, that's where the hard part is how do you start scaling the things that you've done when you can't do everything yourself? Um,
Exactly, exactly. And you're probably all too familiar with that, right?
yes, it's a daily challenge for sure, that leads to working probably far too many hours and difficulty in letting go. I think that's my
Right.
biggest trouble.
Yep, I think we probably in procurement all can relate because we're this, type A personality that, that we know to the level of care that we give. And, there's some people who I like to say, there's integrative negotiation, there's distributive negotiation. Everybody has their own style. But I like to make sure that in the end, it's a mutually beneficial contract and
Mhm.
there's no, win lose game. And uh, I like to make sure that everybody knows at the company that whether it's me or somebody on my team, that that's the same type of approach we're going to do because that's now what we're creating and fostering for the company's procurement mission statement and value. And you're right, it is like our own little company almost within a company. And having been at multiple different like corporations or startups, whether I had a team of 1 or 10, when I was at WeWork, I had a team of 10, and it doesn't matter. It's really about making sure that we're unified in our approach as a
Yeah,
team.
that's so spot on and something that I don't hear enough, because and maybe that's just because that I'm biased to think that way too. That you know you're an you're a business within a business, and so
Hmm.
as that you need to be branding, positioning yourself, consistency. Consistency in it seems like it's maybe too much attention to detail, but consistency in the language that you're using in slide decks between all the people that are talking to your stakeholders, so that the stakeholders see you as kind of a unified one, and that dealing with one is going to be the same as dealing with all. Um,
Completely.
and so many, and it's harder in a bigger organization, for sure. But you see, like decks that some of the team may put together, and you're thinking, is that really the brand that I want to portray to my customer, which is ultimately the stakeholder?
Right.
So for me, every interaction, every little thing like that makes a really big difference.
Oh yeah, and each procurement is such an amazing, interesting field. I really feel so passionately about this because if you think about it, we are as individuals, as an individual person, you are sales because you're
Yeah.
selling yourself to your stakeholders. You are finance because you're looking at the return on the investment all the time, and is the juice worth a squeeze? You are legal because you're also
Mhm.
negotiating legal terms and getting creative with different clauses and working as with that hat on as well. And you're marketing because you're thinking at the end of the day, how do I market my department? How do I market the company? How do I you're representing the company to your vendors. I mean, it's all of these different 5+ roles in one person, and you have that one chance to build that relationship. It's like your first impression
Yeah.
with each stakeholder to sell your department. And so it is really important and key. And that's what I really love about procurement. It's really exciting to get to meet with all those stakeholders and represent that.
It's funny, we talked about the first question of how did you find procurement, and I think that's one of the reasons why so many of us had no idea what procurement was, and we ended up staying there because you get into procurement and then your eyes are open to all these different things and facets that you get involved in that frankly you just don't get engaged in, or the opportunity to. Um, I think especially in the early days, usually you're thrown into procurement and all of a sudden you're working on some pretty big deals that just dwarf anything you may be doing in another part of the organization. And that's definitely one of the attractions I think that keeps a lot of us in the profession.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's funny, it's that rep that we talked about before, that, people have this rep, and I feel like I love that we have the opportunity to change that and to say procurement is not just looking at the bottom line. And when I came into Spin and I hear people say like, "Oh, procurement, we're going to build out procurement," that means that they're going to, now every contract's going to take longer because they're going to want to look at it, and then little by little I'm like, "No, don't worry. I'm going to change your mindset. You're going to want me to
Right.
help you. You're going to want my team. You're going to want more procurement, and you're going to advocate to build out procurement." So I love watching it shift, and I feel very confident in especially with other companies, and seeing how, where there's so many different groups and organizations just for procurement leaders to share and conversate, and you're
Mhm.
seeing how much more this department is being lifted up and really getting a seat at the table with leadership. And I think that we need to just continue to advocate with every business we're in that procurement adds value, and it's not procurement equals savings, procurement equals value. And so I really feel strongly about that. And that's why I love that you have this podcast.
As you talked about procurement equal value, not cost savings, which is 100%. And it's one of the hardest things that we have to overcome as a profession, especially when you've got established procurement teams who have just, that's how I think that we created a rod for our own back sometime, because that's how we got the investment to, I don't want to say professionalize, because that's not fair on folks who were in procurement before the last 20 years, where there's been a big growth in the profession. But where we got a lot of the money for the growth was all predicated around, well, the ROI is cost savings. So we've
Mhm.
backed ourselves into that corner in some regards that we're now furiously trying to dig ourselves out of. um, as we do that, we're trying to push, more of a balanced scorecard, so that people look at the value that we contribute as being beyond savings. And in some organizations, they're more successful at doing that than in others. Where you have this kind of starting from scratch, how did you think about performance metrics and how you actually communicate what success looks like for your procurement team, as it is in terms of helping the business deliver against their objectives?
Yeah, I think that for like we were saying, value equates to a lot of things. And
Hmm.
I think it also has to first drive with what's important to the company, because each company has something that's critical to them. So especially now, uh, and at Spin, you hear a lot about the importance of diversity and inclusion, responsible sourcing, having a vendor code of conduct. And I think that along the lines of looking at a contract and looking at what vendor we're going to work with, obviously we look at price, but within that criteria, I'm building out a section within our criteria evaluation scorecards on D&I.
Hmm.
How responsible is that vendor? Will they align with our code of conduct? And I'm really looking at these as well, and that's part of the value that I really make sure to advocate to the stakeholders that I'm working with. That not only will we help to look at the savings, but we're going to make sure we're working with somebody that's responsible and ethical and aligns with our company culture and our business objectives for that.
Yeah, that's really important, is it? Especially as you continue to grow, because it's, what can be a relatively small contract today can morph itself into something that's, multiple times larger just by the nature of your growth in a pretty short period of time. And at that
Right.
point, they're embedded into the organization just because of what they do. It's hard to extract yourself from a lot of contracts. So taking care of that right at the very beginning, definitely has the rewards later on as you kind of grow into a bigger relationship with those suppliers.
Definitely. Definitely.
Well, Sarah, I know it's about time to wrap up. So, first of all, I want to thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your journey at Spin Mobility. And it sounds like things are definitely going really well, and putting relationships at the heart of that and talking about different value levers. Because even in organizations that are established, as I say, I think that it's so critical, even if we're not able to be measured on that, to be leading our conversations in that way, because that's really how we get engagement. So if anyone who's listening would love to just connect with you, learn a little bit more about your journey, or just just reach out and say hi, like, where's the best place for them to find you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. That's probably the best, easiest way, but my email is connected, so feel free to shoot me an email off of that, and I absolutely would love to connect. I love talking to procurement enthusiasts like me as much as possible, so please, by all means, I'd love it.
Awesome. Well, what I'll do is I'll include a link to your LinkedIn profile in our show notes. Anyone can find those at artofprocurement.com/podcast, and you'll see this episode with Sarah. That's artofprocurement.com/podcast. Sarah, one last time, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Phil. It's really been a pleasure.
I want to thank you for listening into today's episode of The Art of Procurement. To go deeper, including access to transcripts and actionable outtakes from the podcast, join the free level of our AOP Mastermind community. To learn more, go to artofprocurement.com/mastermind. And to find our entire back catalogue of almost 400 episodes, go to artofprocurement.com/podcast.